Ukraine obviously has a lot of these geopolitical challenges, in particular related to Russia, which you have alluded to. You have not mentioned the Nord Stream 2 that is being built. What are your thoughts about it? Is the train, so to say, gone? The pipeline will be built no matter what. There is no more chance, for instance, for the United States to block this through sanctions, and what would be the impact on Ukraine in case it's completed, and why is Europe not being more considerate to Ukraine's interests in this case?
I mean, my guess would be that the pipeline is to a large extent already built. That has to be said. My guess is that the pipeline will complete it, that it will go into operation the one way or the other. That doesn't answer all of the questions. And the question is, what's going to be the capacity of it? What's going to be the... because even with this, there's no way that they can be completely independent of the transit through the Ukraine system. But the question is how much, under which conditions, and how will that be decided? And I know there have been these sort of discussions between Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union. There was a session a couple of weeks ago that produced, as you would expect, nothing. I don't expect anything to come out of that until the end of the year. But of course, there's a need for that sort of agreement. That being said, and that's going to be difficult. I think we're going to have a crisis over that towards the end of the year, the one way or the other. That being said, I'd like to say, although I sort of support the Ukraine position on Nord Stream, I would say I don't see the future of the Ukraine economy being as dependent upon gas transit as it has been. I think it's not necessarily bad long term to have a Ukraine economy that is more dependent upon other things than income from gas transit from Russia. So the gradual reduction of this is painful, but not necessarily in the longer strategic position something that is bad for Ukraine. Ukraine has the possibility of energy independence. Ukraine has the possibility to be independent of the transit fees, but it has to be done in an orderly way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In terms of the conflict resolution with Russia, we have had two Minsk agreements in 2014 and 15. There seems to be very little progress in solving the conflict through Minsk. Some of the presidential candidates, I guess in particular Yulia Tymoshenko, refers to the Budapest Memorandum as an alternative solution that should be more successful. Recently, there's been this SIDIC plan proposed by Mr. SIDIC. UN peacekeeper mission is being discussed. What's your view? Will we stick with Minsk with little progress, or is there potential for some new formats, or that would be better?
I think the essence, the basics of Minsk is where the solution is. You can discuss the details of it. It's a tricky agreement in different details, but the basics of that will not change. Whether you change the format, I mean, I've listened to this Budapest thing. I sort of fail to understand what that really means, because the basis is still there, and it's difficult to avoid. The only realistic possibility that I see is some sort of interim international administration under the auspices of the United Nations for a period to take care of Donbass is a mess. To take care of Donbass, to make it somewhat more democratic, revive the economy and whatever, and to have the gradual reintegration with the rest of Ukraine. That's going to take quite some time and quite significant international efforts. Is Russia ready for this? Well, I think there were some, I belong to those that believe that after the Russian presidential election last year, there was a possibility that they were going to move in that direction. That turned out to be wrong. I think the Kremlin decided to back off that particular option. And I think now the Kremlin is, as I said, the Kremlin doesn't know. The Kremlin is a wait and see. See if sort of Ukraine changes. See if the European Union starts to be weakened. But I don't think either of this is going to happen. And then I think we are back at some point in time to some sort of international administration of the Donbass for a period in order to facilitate the integration of it. We had a similar operation a long time ago, much smaller, in the Balkans, in eastern Slavonia, which worked rather well. It was much smaller, has to be said, but there is a model there that can be used.
Mm-hmm. Is the Kremlin waiting for the results of the presidential election? Do they have some preferred outcomes here?
Their preferred outcome is that there's a mess in Ukraine. And as you know, their basic view is that the Ukrainians are incapable of running a state. I mean, that's their view. And they expect the Ukrainians to demonstrate this more profoundly and them to pick up the pieces, to be quite honest. That's roughly, I would say. And now there's a presidential election and there's a parliamentary election, and I think they're waiting for both of them. Is there something stable that comes out of it? That limits the options. If there's something unstable and messy, that increases the option. I think that their policy is basically opportunistic. It's not particularly strategic. It is primarily opportunistic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what do you think, you have alluded to it already during your speech, but what should be the focus of the next president and the new parliament after the elections so that Ukraine develops well economically and that the fatigue in the EU does not come?
Well, I mean, don't endanger the macroeconomic balance. That's fairly fundamental, of course. I mean, what has been achieved must remain, but then, of course, proceed with, I said, energy independence, achievable but tough. Privatization, where there's enormous amount of work to be done, which will also be very important to curb corruption. I mean, a lot of the corruption is also there in form of these sort of state-owned enterprises and entities that are there that are feeding money to different people of different sorts. So that's going to be important. And then I think the President alluded to that as well, land reform, which is, from the political point of view, a tricky issue, no question about that. But there is a fantastic potential and opportunity for Ukraine long-term if that is done. So if these things are done, sort of the anti-corruption, the energy independence, the privatization, the land reform, I'm quite confident that the Prime Minister mentioned sort of 5% or whatever. There's no reason whatsoever why that should not be achievable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And the president also, as part of his election campaign, announced that he would like to be in a position to apply for EU membership in 2023. Mm-hmm. And the parliament has recently changed the constitution, anchoring the EU and NATO integration into our constitution with an overwhelming majority. If you were Ukrainian president or prime minister, and you have done it in Sweden in the early 90s, what would be the steps and the roadmap towards eventual membership in EU and NATO, and how long it could take?
Well, EU membership is a rather sort of ambitious thing, but I think it's a worthy and necessary goal. But it takes quite some time to prepare for that particular step. So when a membership application will be possible is entirely dependent upon sort of the speed of reform and transformation of the Ukrainian economy and the rule of the law and all of those particular things. That's the one thing which is in your hands. Then another thing is, when will the European Union be ready for further enlargement? That's a more complicated matter. And that's a somewhat divisive issue inside the European Union, as you know. We have a commitment to the countries of the Western Balkans, where the Commission said, I think rather ambitiously has to be said, that by the earliest 2025 it will be ready for the membership of, say, Serbia. I'm not quite certain that will happen, but anyhow, that's what the Commission have said. So that's the law of the land, I guess. Will it be ready for sort of Ukraine and others? That's highly dependent upon Ukraine. There will be people who said no way. But I've always said that first, and there are people who say in the European Union say never any new members, because we don't want more. We have enough of them. I encountered that when Sweden wanted to be member. There were people who said, well, we can't have these funny people in. We don't know where we're going to end up with them. So every single enlargement of the European Union have been met with significant resistance. But every true democracy that has met the conditions, that have knocked on the door, has been allowed in at the end of the day. So in spite of the signals that you can hear from inside the European Union, it is all dependent upon how ready you are. But then the process takes a fairly significant amount of time. But the process is as important as the goal itself, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much. I have exhausted all of my questions. If there are any from the audience, please feel free to raise your hand. If, okay, there's a question.
Thank you very much for being here. I'm from Dragon Capital, and I have a rather more locally focused question. A lot of the populist candidates for presidency mention Budapest Memorandum as a sort of magic button that was miraculously overlooked by the current administration, and the new president would just have to push that button and the Donbas crisis will be miraculously solved. You alluded to that document briefly in your speech, but perhaps you could expand on that a little bit. What do you think is this document about and how much it can actually help?
Well, I mean, the document is fairly well known, and the document was, of course, a document where the signatory countries said that they were going to support the territorial integrity, the sovereignty of Ukraine. It's not the only such document. I mean, every single document that has been signed in Europe and the world says the same thing. So from that point of view, the Budapest Memorandum is significant, but not necessarily more significant than the Paris Charter or the Helsinki Charter or whatever. I've heard at least one candidate trying to explain what it means to replace the Minsk process with the Budapest Memorandum, and I didn't understand it. I think you are, whatever format you have, and you can change formats. You can bring in the Panamanians and the Chinese and the Kenyans and whatever, but you're back to what do you do on the ground? And what do you do with Russia on the ground? And there I would say that the essence of, I would say you have to, in my opinion, what you need to do, you need to have an international presence there in Donbas to make certain that you have some prepared for a democratic election, that the people that are there and the people that have left, by the way, that they, who are the people of Donbas, that they elect their representatives, fair enough, and that we do the economic things in order to sort of repair the worst of the damage that has been there. And then you start the process of integrating this into Ukraine itself. There is whatever format you have, that's the basics. And then sort of the withdrawal of the Russians' influence forces. And you probably have to do this over a fairly prolonged period of time to make it stable. And then you can call it Budapest, or you can call it Minsk, or you can call it Brussels, or you can call it Tashkent, or whatever you want. But that's where we are.
Okay. Oh, there's one more question there.
Thank you. I make this point not totally as a joke to Carl Bildt. My country, the United Kingdom, sadly is about to leave the European Union. There are 65 million of us, which does leave a sizable hole in the European Union. So the old argument that there's no more space for new members seems to me not to be valid. And secondly, it seems supremely ironic that the UK's future relationship with the European Union is going to be modelled on Ukraine's association agreement.
At best.
Yes, exactly. So I would argue that there probably is space, and that will change the overall dynamic, and I think the perception of Ukraine as a potential member of the European Union.
I mean, it's a good point. It's a good point. It has to be said, though, that the United Kingdom inside the European Union has been one of the strong advocates of sort of engagement in this part of the world and enlargement of the European Union, be that the Western Balkans or be that an open door to these. So that voice will be missed. But at the same time, there will be a change in the European Union, and from that point of view, it's a good point. And I would unfortunately say that I hope that the UK ends up with an agreement with the European Union as good as the DCFTA. But if I look at the domestic turmoils, and here you see the dangers of populism. I mean, if there's a victim of populism, you can refer to faraway countries, but the UK is a fairly nearby European country. If you see a country that is very, very much the victim of populism at the moment, it is unfortunately the United Kingdom.
Okay. Oh, one more here.
Andrew Matheny, Goldman Sachs. If the polls are anything to go by, the upcoming election is looking, more and more uncertain in terms of its outcomes. I think we have a pretty good idea of how the EU would engage with the incumbent, were he to win the election. But if we had one of the alternative scenarios, how would you expect that EU foreign policy toward Ukraine would evolve?
Well, that's for the ambassador to sort out. But I would argue that the European Union has a relationship with Ukraine, not with the one or the other person. So whoever is president, whoever is prime minister, the relationship is there because it's with the country, not with the personalities. And the relationship is governed by the DCFTA and by all of the other documents and the mechanisms that are there. And I'm quite certain that the European Union and member countries will engage intensely with whoever is coming out of these elections.
Oh, there's one more in the back there.
Thank you, Tomas. Jim Brook, Ukraine Business News. Mr. Bildt, you mentioned that you predict that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline will be completed and will probably start running this time next year. As you know, on Thursday, France and Germany reached some sort of compromise because Romania was leading a major resistance to this. I was wondering how you think this will take shape. Will Gazprom have to sell out their ownership of the pipeline under unbundling? Will there be minimal guaranteed transit gas flows through Ukraine? I mean, how do you see the mechanics 1 year from now for the pipeline running?
I don't know. That's the honest answer. Because first, I haven't seen the details of what came. I mean, first, to go to the procedure, and please correct me. The procedure is that there's been a compromise now between the French and the Germans, I understand. This has to go to the Council. So it has to be all of the member states. Then it has to go to the Parliament. The European Union is not an entirely easy thing when it takes decisions. And then comes your questions. Well, whatever comes out of the European Union process, then how is that implemented? Unbundling or whatever, that is dependent on it is. I would guess that there will be some complications to it, but I would still guess that my basic prediction will come true. And then I would say that even more important will be how the sort of the gas transit and the other issues are sorted out, including the Naftogaz, Gazprom legal dispute. So it's a bundle of issues that needs to be handled, and I think that I don't think we'll have any clarity on any of these issues until, at the earliest, at the end of the year. I'm sorry if that was not a particularly clear answer, but I think that's where we are.
Thank you. Maria Repko, Center for Economic Strategy. You talked about the pipeline, the gas transit that Ukraine may lost after Russia builds Nord Stream. So even Russian analysts, they know that the Russian Nord Stream project is not profit-based or profit-motivated. It is motivated either by political idea or by some other ideas. such as vested interests or so. In Ukraine, there is a thought that if Russia builds Nord Stream and Ukraine is no more the way to transport Russian gas to Europe, then we will have a defense issues coming, like being much more relevant than now when Russia depends on Ukraine. What is your thinking about it?
Yes, I've heard that argument, and I don't. I mean, the argument is really sort of that Russia should be careful with Ukraine because otherwise Russia can't sell its gas to Germany. I doubt that. I mean, the defense of Ukraine is far more robust things. I think by this time, the Kremlin knows that any aggression against Ukraine carries a very, very steep international price. There could have been the misunderstanding in 2013-14 that the international community was looking elsewhere and that we had not been perhaps as robust in our response to 2008 in Georgia as I think we should have been, but I don't think that misunderstanding can be there any longer. So I think the defense of Ukraine is far more significant than just the pipeline.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bildt. That was very interesting for us. Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.
We'll,